All right, welcome everyone at the multi-networking community sync. It's July 12th. Today we gonna cover some AIs from last week and then continue our discussion about the CAP. Last week, I think we finalized on the pod network interface object, and we can kind of start from there. But before that, the AIs. Just to remind folks, we were talking initially about reducing the scope from the phase one. And one of the kind of question and doubts was whether we should kind of reduce the ability to uh, retrieve networking information for the pod from within the pod. And one of the ideas was to use downward API. I looked into that, and basically downward API is something similar to how you can pass a I wasn't aware of that, so that's something that I just learned myself as well. But basically, this is something similar to how you can pass any of the metadata, like name or namespace, inside the pod through the environmental variables. It's just ability to provide these kind of the path to that environmental variables, and it's understood by kubelet. So that's what the download API is. I think that's useful, and I think that might be the way to provide the APIs. We did in the requirement mention that it can be. It doesn't exactly have to be that. That was one of the proposals, but I think unless someone else in the room has some other ideas on how to do that, I think that will be the way to do this. I think the question was whether we really need it in phase one, considering and the kind of question was as well how much of work it is to do this. I think in terms of amount of work, I would say is medium sized, considering I saw the example of how huge pages API has been passed. So there is a CL there, a PR, sorry, that adds it. So there is an example of how to do it. But then basically, I would try to limit our scope, even having that example, unless we are going to have a I'm looking at it maybe from the perspective of myself doing this whole thing. That's why I'm a bit reluctant on pushing that. So I am towards kind of still pushing that out. I think in terms of having this item in the cap, I think we can definitely mention that in. But I will still want to punt it to the next phase. And it's not like we are never going to do it. It's just we just want to push it in a phase so that we can make it till September with this. Any objections to this? Or any thoughts?
So Matze, I know that Tomo had comments about this, but he's not able to attend today. So could we keep this in the agenda for next week's meeting?
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
And I think there was another AI. I think we were having discussion. Michael Cambria is not here. We were having discussion about the ability to call multiple, create multiple CNIs with single call, and how far we should go with support for such case, right? And I'm not referring to, it is slightly what Multus doing today as well, because it boils down to what the CNI can configure, right? With chaining, you could basically, with single network attachment definition, having one configuration, and since it's the CNI configuration, one CNI can have multiple calls to multiple CNIs, and it will, with single call, create multiple interfaces. And question is, should our case here support this? And I think Tomo was just strongly asking about this. There are some examples of how this has been done by the, I think that was, what was the company? I think Uber, or he provided an example of a company doing this. I think this was the one here. I'm not sure anyone else has had a chance to look into this, but what it boils down to being the use case itself is slightly different. It's not at all about multi-networking. It's just about an compatibility, that use case. So they add an additional interface just to kind of support a host networking, not host networking, access to host network, and have a faster path for that. And this is how they chose to do this. So, and the question stands whether something like that is we should represent here in the pod networking. I am feeling kind of opposed that because then having multiple interfaces with single CNI call kind of breaks the whole concept of whatever we do today, like by the basic standard for Kubernetes. I know that's possible, but that's just the CNIs as an implementer capability, right? And I don't think we should implement this API, should implement whatever the CNI can support. CNI, as we mentioned before, is one of the implementers, and they can do that, and basically they are not limited to anything, right? As every other implementation can do whatever they wish. And the question is whether how they fit into Kubernetes at that point. So that's kind of my take on this one. I think Tomo again is not here. Any other voices on that?
Yeah, so I'm gonna say a bit the same thing. Last time we discussed this last week, we were missing valuable input from Michael.
Yeah.
He's not here still. I guess he will be back for next week's meeting, so perhaps we can discuss this in next week's meeting. But I can recap a bit the general concern. And during the time we have been using Multus, we have recognized this as a valuable use case that we were not able to achieve with Multus. So this would be a nice to have. So if we are not expecting to cover this use case, I guess at least we should acknowledge it explicitly somewhere and log it somewhere that, hey, we discussed about this use case. We don't want to support it, so let's log that somewhere. In any case, I expect valuable input from Michael next week or whenever he comes back. There is another area of concern. So this is nice to have that we cannot do with Multus. That might be supported by a CNI-based implementation. The specific attachment parameters, that's another topic we have discussed, and maybe you will come back to that later on, but that's another thing that is hard that we want to have, that it's not possible with Multus. So having specific parameters on the attachment that can be passed down to implementations. So those two are nice to haves that we can discuss if we want to support them or not. And we can just log that we had this discussion and the reasoning behind not supporting them if we decide not to support them. And the other general concern that we have is what can we do today with Multus and a CNI-based implementation that is going to be prevented to be achieved because of this specification. So it's nice that I agree that we consider CNI and Multus as a potential specific implementation of this CAP. But if we are going to consciously prevent things that can be done today with Multus to be possible to be done with this implementation, then we should acknowledge that as well and log it somewhere and log that we have an active discussion that's something that could be previously done with a CNI-based implementation with Multus is no longer going to be possible with this CAP. Because I expect users that are currently using Multus or CNA-based implementations to be wanting to migrate to this implementation or to this spec app. And if there are scenarios where they are not going to be able to do that, then we should acknowledge that. And
So just to answer the one concern, I don't think we're gonna block anything
So
because there is. Give me a second.
yeah,
Because you can still do whatever you do today, and whether you're gonna use Pod Network at the API is different. So saying that we're gonna block something completely, that's not true. It's we are not going to represent that with this API. Maybe that's your question, because you're still gonna be able to do this the same way you're doing today. It's not like we're gonna prevent you from doing this. Is whether this API is going to represent this. So let's make sure that's let's not call it out that we are going to block something, because we are not blocking anything. Each implementation can still do whatever they wish. And this is just me being picky about the wording here, but let's make sure that's the case, because nobody's going to block anything here. It's just whether the API is going to support a specific use case. Okay, Jamie?
fair enough.
Yeah. Okay. So
Fair enough.
so
But
yeah.
I just wanted to call out have to have this in mind as we're discussing how
Right,
the
okay.
work continues forward. Yeah.
Fair.
now I was going to say, as soon as you start talking about things like this, right? When you say add multiple, add and remove, or do you go with the where you present, rather say this is the interfaces I want, and present the full structure, right? I mean, we will always end up in those discussions. I think the current situation where you just add and remove one interface is the worst. It would be better to do add or remove of many, so you get fewer calls. But my preference is probably still to have a declarative and say this is the interfaces, and then let CNI figure out how to do what's needed.
Right.
And sort of declare at the top and let the underneath figuring out what needs to be done.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments? Mohab, you want to say something? If you are.
I mean, I think this is more a discussion where CNI is discussed, right? And the requirement towards them, right?
That's true, right? That's what I'm saying, right? Treating CNI as an implementation and how that implementation now fits towards the.
Yeah, we can have discussions with them what we think is the best way. But I mean, it's
true.
It's there. Michael, do you bring this, or?
I think that was brought by Tomo.
But also Michael, I think he works still on the CNI side.
Which Michael you have in mind?
Sapa.
Oh, yeah, no, I think.
Almost more on the Multus side, right?
Right. So if we were to even like make this, let's make an exercise out of this, right? What will that mean if we were to do and want to support that? If we say that a pod network represents your infrastructure in some way, or ability to connect to it's hard, a network, but I'm not sure, infrastructure, but let's say this is infrastructure inside your cluster, not external infrastructure, just to kind of sake of using different word. So let's say you want to have an infrastructure to which fills in all the requirements that we defined. So basically one of the main requirements is all the pods can communicate between each other on that infrastructure, network infrastructure, right? That's the main requirement. How you achieve this you can do this, and this is what even Tomo brought up, the other use case here, the one that I think that was, I'm not sure who was that, Lyft or someone, but basically from this use case, even that was Lyft. Oh, there it is. So even from this use case that he was proposing here, that was exactly how they were achieving the connectivity. And that was one interface for connectivity between the nodes and the other interface for the connectivity on the node. So that was the reason they created the two interfaces at a single call, just to achieve that connectivity everywhere, right, between the pods. So, and that's how they choose to do that, and that's why they do this, right? If implementation willing to do that and then kind of play together with all the rest of the APIs that we have in Kubernetes, and then yes, kind of sky's the limit, right? At that point, and everyone can do whatever, right? But should we now represent those two interfaces in some ways to a interface? I don't think we should, considering we rely on a single IP per the infrastructure connector, or per kind of infrastructure, which fits towards then all the like network policy objects or services. Otherwise, if we were to represent with a single item two of those, then that's kind of, now we have to refactor most of this other stuff, which basically is impossible. So today's API doesn't, like the other infrastructure, the other APIs that we have today in Kubernetes doesn't even support that use case that I can have with single CNI, multiple interfaces, and then represent that towards the other elements of the API. That's kind of my opinion, and that's kind of my attempt to argument this against this. It's a monologue. Any other comments?
Argue against the current situation or argue against introducing interfaces? I hope it's the first.
Argue against supporting this. Argue against having our API support such use case, that my single pod network introduces two interfaces into the pod, so can introduce two IPs into the pod, and so on and so forth.
Two IPs is one thing, two interfaces is another thing, right? But
yeah, that's true, right? But basically, two interfaces from the same family. I would even be more
two interfaces on the same family on the same network, or all in all?
On the same pod network, yes. No, on per pod network, because more than I can. Apologies. More is every then other IP on the pod is represented by a pod network, right? API. So that's kind of what we want to have, and that's proper, right? Because then that's how we identify things on the pod. If I have pod network that can connect multiple interfaces at once to a single pod, and those can get their own IPs, or their own IPs on this one, because that's my problem. And going back to even the Lyft use case, they don't even assign the IPs. They leverage the kernel capability that the IP defined in the namespace is assumed by all the interfaces, and they even don't assign the IP to the other interface. So basically, it's just a pipe to the local host.
Today with with V6, right? It's easy to one interface from the outside, use route and sort of push in, so you get any number of addresses on that interface, right? On different L3 networks. So that I think needs to be supported. If you have different physical interfaces or not, why would a pod care? It wouldn't even,
I agree. At this point,
even understand it.
We are, but look at it from different point of view. If you would have multiple of those, I agree with you. That use case is covered, right? Because each L3, and you can have that implementation as well, but this still works for us. What you just said, where we can have just single interface, physical interface, let's say physical, like virtual or whatever you use. But let's say we have one interface in your namespace, and then each pod network represents the specific L3 network that you connect through that interface. And that's, we can model that, right, with this API. That's possible. Now, What if I have other way around? I have single pod network, and now that introduces those two L3 networks for you. Is that something that you would want to do? That's the question, right? Because now you have the single interface, you have single pod network, but that single pod network adds two V4s, so two separate subnets, L3 subnets. Is that something that you would want to model with
I would
this?
say with IPv6, that's standard practice. You create as many layer 3 subnets, whatever you want to call them, on the same network. You just add more and more. That's how people set up networking. On the same physical, you can have 3 or 4. I mean, you always had a link local.
But
Okay,
how would you want to represent that in API? That's my question, because
So-
we're talking here an API only, right?
So
Are those network, you don't, question to you then in that case that you said, because that's what I was describing before, that with this API you could represent each of those V6 networks with a separate pod network. Would that not work?
yeah, so but the question is what is a pod network, right? Is it so we discussed different types of pod networks. So if you call what we call just a layer 3 network,
Yeah.
then you represent one of them. How the implementation managed to do that, if it sets up link local and that's what you have to drive your L3, or if it sets up 2 networks, it's really up to the implementation. So I think it's you get back to that. If someone sets up like call it more an Ethernet-like network, you have a layer 2 network where you can do things over, and then someone on top of that does layer 3 networking. Well, sort of you get what you ask for, right? But I mean, what is a
Right.
pod network? Again, is it, we did discuss, is it a sort of an Ethernet type of network? So you have one network that goes and you tie.
No, that's the thing. Pod network represents your whatever your
So
implementation does.
this again, is it one network that you use over all your nodes and attach pods to, or is it something that a designer has set up and a design, right? So you have a structure where you have maybe one network per node that you attach pods to, and then you route in between. It's without having a way to understand that connectivity, at what level are you connected, and what is the topology otherwise. It's really hard to do an API that can cater to all of them. Then you're going to have to do the worst case always. I think, and that's, I mean, we had those discussions before, right? When we discuss the IP connect, IP network, networks of type IP and networks of type Ethernet. Without knowing what you have, they're so different.
Right, but then with the current, are you saying the current API won't represent both?
I'm saying that I think we need to specialize on the type, because there's so much more freedom in when you have a network of type Ethernet, right? Then people can run whatever on it. And as a user, I should be able to expect to do all these things. If you specify to say that you have IP connectivity, then that's what you have. We can specify and sort of say that when you have that, you get one IP address that you're going to use. If the implementation hangs up a couple of others, it has nothing to do with the pod that's using it. You have your IP, you can send out, you can route out, and you have one address. Sort of it's set by, we sort of from Kubernetes standpoint, we can specify this network type gives you these services and should behave like this. But with Ethernet, if I then decide to do L3s on top of it, the whole world is open. It can be connected to, I mean, to normal machines on the outside, and all sort of weird stuff can happen there. So the Ethernet it's what we have today through Multus and so on. But I mean, it's the thing that we should try to make sure that it's only used in very rare cases, like if you want to run a router, or if you want to run on some Ethernet type of protocol. The normal connect should be an IP connect, and we should specify, and we can put much more restrictions in what that is than what you can do.
So I think I would answer this way. That the APIs today rely on the other APIs that we have to fit towards, right? Rely on IP for network policy and services and ingress and what's not.
I can promise. So I've been gone. I mean, you haven't seen me. I was just in last week, and I need to drop now. I've been gone for like 5-6 weeks. I'll promise for next week, I will read through everything that's been said over the last 2
Okay.
months and sort of where the spec is, and I'll contact you on the side channel, Magic.
Sure. There is
We-
there are recordings. There's link here on the top to
Yeah, yeah.
recordings. If you want to take each hour,
I'll
1 hour
go
long.
and look
So
at the scores as well, and sort of
if you
what's
want
happening.
to, those you can look at least the agenda, then you can watch the recording from that date, and
Okay.
that gives you some
Thanks.
insight.
Take care. See you next guy. See you next
All
week.
right. I think just to kind of finalize on this, I think our to what Per was saying in terms of like the Ethernet connection, that's like this. Let's assume this is just L2 at that point, right? Which then would definitely will have a reduced functionality, Kubernetes functionalities to what we have to what's available, right? And I think standard should be going and the IP layer, right, where we will have the IP on which we can rely on. And I think this is the hardest case. That's what I want to try to get to. That having the and managing the IP is the hardest case, which the pod network should represent. Wim?
Yeah, so I think what we are discussing here is as you just said, is the ability to assign multiple IP addresses to the same interface, right?
Not exactly. Can multiple IP addresses be represented by single pod network? Because what you said, it is possible to do with multiple pod networks, right? If each IP is represented by separate pod network, I could model it that way, and that would work, right? The question is,
Yeah, but yes, but then in that case, you have as the way I'm looking at this cap is you will have an additional, let's say, virtual NIC or whatever interface in the pod that is connected to that network. That's why I made the distinction between. Okay. So yeah, that was actually my question is, are we able, in regular networking, like secondary IPs is something that is used a bit, quite a bit, yeah, that is used. So in other words, you basically have a network, you have an interface, and then you configure multiple prefixes onto it. Now the question is whether we have to support that and how. But that there is a number of use cases that do that.
Yeah, I hear you. It's the question now to you is each of those subnets that you connect to that single interface, do you wish to represent them as do you need a handle for each of those subnets or of those L3 networks that you connect to that single interface? Do you need a handle for that? Or do you just need a handle to the interface that you connect to, and then the other IPs is something that you do internally? Because there's that aspect, right, of what functionality from Kubernetes do you expect on each of those networks, right? Or all those L3 networks, which you call like multiple IPs, but let's call them L3 level, right? Networks. So if I expect for each of the L3s to have the full Kubernetes capabilities, then I would position this as each subnet being represented by separate pod network object. Even then, but then my implementation can kind of implement in such a way that I will apply all those networks on a single interface of the pod, right? It doesn't mean what you mentioned, that each pod network represents a new interface inside the pod. That's what we are familiar with today, but from KEP's point of view, it doesn't have to be like that. And it's basically boils down to the implementation. If your implementation can achieve that I have one interface, and then I always pipe one, and then what pod networks you want to have? Okay, you want to have default, you want to have AB and full. So I will just add those networks, so those IPAMs, create the IPAMs for that interface there, and there you go. Create routes, whatever I have to do. But that's my implementation knows all the specifics and does that. right?
But
Or
what,
go
what
ahead.
you're saying actually, is it up to the implementation to decide how they do the plumbing into the pod
Yeah.
itself? Yeah.
That's true. Yes, that's the point, right?
So
That's how
what you're suggesting is basically, yeah, even if you have two pod networks and they all, there is a pod connected to the same pod networks, each having a different IP, the implementation could actually model this as two different interfaces or a single interface with two different sub.
exactly. Yeah, that's if your implementation wants to handle it that way. Yes. That's what this API can represent. The pod network API doesn't decide that, oh, it has to be a separate ETH, right, in the pod namespace.
Yeah.
It doesn't. It's up to your, if you're but keep in mind then your implementation has to handle, pipe it all through and do all the plumbing, whatever is needed for that. But then that's your implementation. That's how you handle it, right? Most use cases that we are familiar, or at least I'm familiar with, and most of us are familiar with probably, is we always see a pod network as a separate interface in the namespace of a pod, right? Where it's a separate ETH, and then because that's how we usually do that. But Pair is bringing up the L3 use case, right? Where it's not, doesn't have to be, right? It can be a separate L3. That's that's why we my initial kind of proposal from last year had all the L2 parameters, MAC address, IP, what's that. But then Per said, why? I might not have that. My network is gonna be just IPs, and he was right, right? Because that can be right. My implementation can do completely different things. It can be just a single pipe to the pod, and then my pod networks are isolated or layered completely different way, right? It doesn't have to be always L2. That's what this API, and this API currently as we have it can do that, can model it, right? Same way. You
So
see that?
I'll take an action. Yes, yeah, I do know because one of the one of the drivers for the SCEP is also telco, right? So in telco you have all
Definitely,
these
yeah.
weird
Mhm.
applications, because they model the physical world into the, let's say, originally to virtual and then to container. So I know in the virtual space, we as representing Nokia right now, we had this use case quite a bit. I'm not sure in the container, so I'll check for next week meeting to see whether for containerized implementation we still need or have this set of requirements.
Mhm.
But I do know in the OpenStack days this was used a lot.
All right. Any other comments to this? I think we can try talk about this. I'm not sure. Next week, another half an hour probably gonna take, and if we're gonna start again with that one, I hopefully not. We won't have to. We'll see if Tom can join next week and convince him on this. All right, let's continue on the CAP itself. Last week we ended discussion on the pod network interface object. And I just want to share this stuff. Is that the right one? Yeah. So we were discussing on, let's maybe go from the just a bit of the reminder. How we could change the pod spec and basically ability to provide parameters to how you attach to a pod, right? You either just directly say what network I want to attach to, or you want to provide some additional parameters on how I attach for this specific pod, right? And I was thinking of introducing this pod network interface object, and this is the guy here. Network interface, that's supposed to be pod network interface. Which would contain as ability, again, to point to a custom resource that will then per implementation have whatever. I think this would work for most use cases. From the voices that we heard last week was to having ability to that's something that I was kind of initially mentioning this that this object could be only specified by single pod, because I was thinking of having this having some, like, for example, IP address and MAC address parameters, which would then be applicable just per pod. So it could not be reused in replica set. But I think we discussed that we should be able to do both, right? Either this guy is specified per once per pod or multiple per pod, where I additionally provide some tweaks to how my network is attached, right? And I think here was, and one of the examples was where my pod network is represented by, let's say, a simple MAC VLAN and then additional high performance SRLV. And they are connected to the same infrastructure network. And now when I'm infrastructure, it's the environment that I'm in. They are all connected to the same L2. And I want to have ability to now to kind of choose between one or the other, the high performance or none, and then they are still the same subnet and same IPAM represented by one pod network object, which is a valid use case, because that's then how, so that we can kind of fit into, since IPAM is the story behind services and network policies, so that we don't have to replicate those for the if we were to split those two networks, that's what we would want to achieve. The parameters ref then could be the additional implementation specific indicator on which network, high performance or normal, and how I want to attach to those, right? So this was good, but then I was thinking about this one. The status for this guy has name, IP address, and MAC address. Those are per pod items, and those cannot be in this approach, right? If I can apply same interface spec to multiple pods, I cannot, each pod cannot report whatever the status of this is, right? And this is where I am losing on capability, because this then works for the case where I want to use the same for multiple pods, but then this doesn't work for a case where I want to have one per pod, right? How would I report an information of this per pod? I think that's an question, will that even be possible at that point, right? Probably not. Because then this guy doesn't can report only stuff by the implementation, and then whether these parameters are ready or not. So maybe the question here would be this: do we need a object that will really represent how a pod, how the attachment to a pod is done, like networking information of that? Because that's currently, we don't have that data. The only thing that we today have is in pod status, and let me show that, this guy. So basically what we today have is this, right? Those two things. And I slightly modified that, I will get to that, but basically this is the only thing we have about networking information, how the pod is attached. Considering we all rely on IPs, should we then just, is this sufficient? That's the question here. Any opinions on this one? Now, when I think about this, considering the network can be represented in various ways, someone can have L2, someone can L3. I don't think there is one way we could represent each attachment for each of the implementations. So maybe that's right. The only thing that we should represent is IP, and anything else should be provided by the implementation itself. Maybe that should be the case. I think that could be right to do that. So here, in terms of like this object, any other comments on this object?
Yeah, the clarification. So in other words, Maciek, if you would say that this network would be, let's say, using SRIOV or so on, that would be then specified in the parameters ref, right? Is my understanding
Yeah,
correct?
the implement. Let's assume. Let's try to kind of model this with Multus, right? So Multus, what would Multus do is, let's start from the top on this one. So where is my pod network? Here. So pod network will point to, where are you? No, this. Pod network will have parameters references, right? And basically pod network for that use case would have two links to two network NADs, right? One will be, let's call it slow, and let's it be MacVLAN, right? And the other will be, the other is fast, and this is SRIOV. Let's say that's we have those two network attachment definitions. Those are internally defined so that they share the IPAM range, right? So basically they are connected to the same L2 in this case, and they share the subnet, those two guys, right? But now this is definition of pod network, right? The thing here is right now, how do I pick one of the other, right? One over the other, or what's that, right? Still the IPAM is the same, but now how do I pick one of them? And to do that, now you go to the pod, maybe then you create a, the next thing that you create will be the pod network interface, right? So that would mean on how you attach to a specific pod, and then you would reference your own object in here. And let's assume Multus comes up with some sort of new CRD that defines that, right? Right now they have all the kind of structure defined inside as the annotation JSON. I'm not sure how much you all folks are familiar, but Multus beside network attachment definition has the kind of JSON format of the annotation that you can specify in pods annotation, right? So let's assume that whole thing is being transferred into a new CRD, and it is being referenced here. In that CRD, they as well added some enumerator stating select NAD 1 or 2, right? And basically this is how I would define that. Okay, for those pods, I create here a reference to the new CRD that says, okay, I want to use the fast connection, right? So that's how would I define it here through this pod network interface object. And then lastly, inside the pod, then I, instead of saying I want to connect to the network, I connect, let me just maybe just copy paste it correctly. So no, not this. So then inside the pod, what I do is for some of the pods, I will use, instead of network directly, I will use a pod network interface name, and I point to that network interface that I created, right? So my interface fast. I have to specify either pod network interface name or the network, right? One of the two. And then basically I know that this pod is going to use the fast, right? And then there can be another pod which for which I will create a pod interface which will use the slow one, the MacVLAN approach. And then instead of using fast, I will use the other one on that, right? This will still have to comply with one of the conditions here, this guy. No, not this. Yeah, I think this is the same thing, because this is the indirect restriction, and that restriction is to allow only always one pod network per pod. So basically, though it's not directly listed here, but I should not be able to do something like this. Let's say fast and slow. This should not be allowed because those two reference the same pod network. So I should not be able to connect twice to the same thing. So basically this should not be allowed, right?
Is that not contradicting what we said before in the previous discussion?
No, because each connection should be a separate. Then that will fit because then each of the connection is a separate pod network. You see?
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, you're right,
So
yeah,
pod
yeah.
network, you see, and then that kind of drives us. Is this kind of clear, or there are some doubts on this? Anyone else have some questions on that?
I do.
Yeah, go ahead.
So if I were to interpret this as I'm seeing it right now, it means that we cannot have two interfaces attached to the same network, right? If I were to interpret what I kind of I'm reading here.
In a single
Which is-
pod. In a single pod.
In a single pod.
Yeah.
Which is something that we can do today with Multus. So this is one of the examples that I talked before that. That's one of the examples that I talked before that we should track what we can do with Multus today. And if we plan to not be able to do it with this cap, then we should, you know, log it somewhere and have a log what the reasoning behind that. So
And Jaime, I will answer you this. Multus is not the end of all the, and this is not to satisfy Multus. I will answer to you this. I know you're subjective to Multus, but let's make sure Multus is not all in all for how multi-networking is done, because it's not exactly. It is the first one, I bet you, and it's the most popular. But let's make sure it's not the all in all. So, and I'm bringing that other, and that's, I'm a bit teasing you here. I apologize for that. But why? Maybe I will tell you this. Why I am bring this up, because, and this is maybe we can have some folks kind of left already, but we can have more discussion on this next time when we have more audience. But the reasoning for limiting a single interface per pod is exactly to what I'm kind of saying from the very beginning of today, because most of the other features in Kubernetes rely on only IP. Okay, and we should not be able, we should not be having multiple IPs, multiple connections to the same pod network, right? Because then you see here on the bottom, you would have, let's say you would have, this is V6, right? So V6 is acceptable, right? V4, V6, because those are IPs. But then if I were to have something like this, right, where I have one IP and second IP connected to the same network, what do I do then? What do I do with the service? To which endpoint do I route you, right? If you said, considering we want to differentiate all the other objects based on pod network, right? Pod network is the centerpiece of this whole thing, right? So service is to a pod network policy is to a pod network, and so on and so forth. Considering that the pod network is the identifier of the interfaces of your, let's call it infrastructure, what I said, right, of inside the Kubernetes cluster, how do I identify which do I refer to? So you see, in this case, this doesn't work with services and endpoint slices, all that, right? That's where I'm coming from. And now I think one of the use cases for Multus is, for example, bridging two SROV interfaces, right? I always know that that's one of the use cases where I want to have the two SROV interfaces connected to my pod, because I want to just bridge them internally, which basically what I care about is just L2 at that point. If we care about in this use case that I mentioned, the bridging, we care about just L2. We don't care about IP anyway. Why? Then we don't care about those two interfaces being in the same pod network. Then those two can be in separate pod networks, right? And then you can model it that way, right? Each of the interfaces, because they have to be in separate switches for the redundancy, right? That's the whole point of the kind of having them two and then bridging. So they have to be in different switches. So basically I create pod network switch A, pod network switch B, and then attach pod network A and B to the pod, and then bridge internally, and then do whatever I have to do. And that's all then based on the workload, how they do that, right? It's definitely not exactly what you can do today, because you can multiply Multus call out Multus multiple times and be done with that. But you must make sure that even with that, you must make sure you reach out from different PFs if it's a CRV case, right? Because otherwise it beats the purpose, right? If it's not the same, if it's coming from the same PF, there is no point of you bridging those, right?
So let me answer you with two very specific comments about what you told me.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
So I am not saying, and I want to be clear about this, I'm not saying that we should support all the Multus use cases.
Mhm.
What I'm saying is that a lot of people that are using Multus today, which is the and the wider, I guess that it's the multi-network spec that is being used today, or the widest one, the broadest one. People that are going to be moving to Multus this, and people that are going to find that their use case is not going to be possible with this cap. I mean, it's okay that we decide that to happen. So I'm not saying that we should support all the multi-use cases. I'm just saying that we should be aware and we should have a conscious decision about it, because that is something that's gonna happen. A lot of people that are going to be using multis are going to want to move to this cap.
Yeah, definitely. So
okay.
Jaime, which use case will not be covered here with what I just described and with that restriction that I'm trying to push?
Having multiple attachments to the same network.
Yeah,
in a single pod.
what sort of use case do you want to do here? What is the real use case? Having that capability, that's one thing. What is the real use case you want to address with that capability? That's my question to you.
I don't know. I don't have a real use case at hand right now.
All right, so well, one of the use cases that I described is one of those, right? And we can model it in a way where we can go around it. But what are the real other use cases that will require what you do, that capability? That's my question to you. I know that's keep in mind there is much more, and same goes with the CNI. CNI can do this multiple interfaces with one call. And that doesn't mean that we have to that the capabilities are there, we know, but doesn't mean that we have to model all of them.
So that's right. So for me, it's really easy to call up things that I can do with Multus and I cannot do with this cap. I'm not saying that I have a use case for them or that we should support it,
right.
But I'm saying it's very easy for me to call them up, and it's very easy for me to be aware and to discuss them and decide
right.
whether we want it or not. That's the only
thing. So this needs to all be driven by use cases, if anything, examples of how really it is being used. Because just having the capability for the sake of it, I say that's not a argument. Okay. If we have and I do have some experience, maybe Wim can even add us from his side, maybe from the telco side of what sort of deployments they do. But from my experience myself, the main usage of multiple interfaces from the same network attachment was for the bridging of SRV interfaces. That was the only use case I can think of. And it can be done here as well. I know the capability is there for Multus, but yeah, it won't be fully modeled because we want to, integrate with the rest of Kubernetes. We don't want to do more than just what Multus can do today, right? It's limited what Multus can do. Wim, you want to say something?
Yeah. So I mean, I agree. I mean, in my view, having it will be a really exceptional case to do something like that, in my view. One question I had, for example, one use case that is used, which potentially leads to multiple IPs, but they will be on the same subnets on the interface. It's like, it's like an Anycast gateway. So you have like let's say a physical IP, an IP attached to your pod, right? Let's say you have two pods, each with a dedicated IP. But then you have like an Anycast address that is routing to both. So I believe, my understanding is that the way to do this is through a service, right? Is that you would add a service that points to basically both IPs, and that's how we would implement something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, depending on what yeah, exactly. Then you would have just load balancer between the two, right? Unless it has to be multicast, and then that's slightly different, right? Because then you might want to, depending on what you want to do exactly, It's still, but you still need just one IP, right? For even multi.
Correct. And that's why I'm saying is that what we have seen before is not necessarily applicable here because we are doing things differently now. So that's what I was talking about.
Doing differently may be big of a word,
I
but
mean,
definitely
we
wants
have
to.
different constructs. We have different constructs to achieve that.
Yeah. We exactly. We want to achieve a full integration with the Kubernetes, so that's the main goal here, right? All right, let's still think of it. Jaime, I would appreciate if you could provide some other use cases to kind of for the need of, and there was like comments, I think, from Peter as well for that purpose. I think there was not only from Peter, there was some other comments. I think maybe Wim, that was you as well. Look for the comments. There were some other folks bringing the same issue up, right? With the restriction of single one pod network per pod, right? In the comments, you probably can find them. And I would appreciate, Jaime, if you could provide some other use cases from the users that you can know of, or you can maybe ask around of what will be the real blocker for that restriction. All right, we are at the time. Any other last comments? All right, thanks everyone. Hear from you next week.
Thanks, Maciek. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.